Here's one without a punchline. I never did figure out exactly what was going on. Several years ago I went down to Guatemala. It's not important why, the only thing you need to know is that me and a few others were going to be meeting one-on-one with a bunch of locals over about 2 weeks, me and a colleague. She's not important. I discover early on that many of the women we talk to are scared to go to the hospital, try to figure out why, but locals won't say, make a note of it, and move on. We were on a tight schedule. I don't forget about it though. Going forward I make a point of gauging how everyone feels about the hospital. It's clear they're uncomfortable talking about it. This is ringing alarm bells in my head because it's very pertinent to why I'm here in the first place. Anyway, there's a local doctor I'm in close contact with, call him Dr. Gomez. He works at the hospital in question. Second day of my arrival, I meet up with him. I tell him what I'm hearing so far. Now, most of you reading this will think these are ignorant peasants. They're probably just scared of modern medicine, but take it from someone who works closely with Central American rural farmers and villagers all the time. That's just a cliche. Many are deeply superstitious, of course, but they're not scared of modern medicine. They just think modern treatments are less effective than herbal remedies anyway. That's not the point. The point is Dr. Gomez actually tries to sell me on this ignorant peasant bullshit. Not in those words. This sets off more alarm bells. It's a very strange thing for a doctor to say about his own community. Now I'm suspicious not just of the hospital, but of Dr. Gomez as well. Keep this to myself. The next day, I'm meeting with locals again. My colleague and I are moving down a list of families. We're about a quarter of the way down this list by the third day. The first few people that we meet with express the same wariness about the hospital that the others did. Again, they won't really say why. About halfway through the day, everything changes. Anytime I bring up the hospital, people sing its praises. It's like that for the entire rest of the day. I'm puzzled. What do I make of this turn of events? Decide to follow a hunch. The next day I backtrack. My colleague continues moving down the list, meeting with locals, while I revisit a few families that we've already talked to. Suddenly all of those people are changing their tune. I mention that they expressed concerns about the hospital before. They deny it. I become more direct, reading from my notes. They still deny it. Then it hits me. They're all parroting the same thing. It's like someone's been coaching them. Fuck. I guess I've got to tell you a bit more about why I was there to explain this next part. So I was sent down to Guatemala because there's an obesity and diabetes epidemic down there. Local government was working jointly with doctors and scientists to develop a nutritional guideline. Nobody follows it. Government is perplexed. I was brought in to have a roundtable discussion with the local scientific community to work on resolving what they regarded as a cultural issue. Dr. Gomez was one of the participants in this discussion. All participants were provided with the list that my colleague and I would use in conducting our interviews with the locals, so drive. Gomez had this list. I thought about his suspicious hand-waving and the fact that roughly after I'd spoken with him, everyone began changing their story. Realize I'm about to be totally stonewalled if I don't do something. So I decide to go off script. I jump to the end of the list, visit a family living at the outer edges of the village. When I get there, I see Dr. Gomez leaving. He doesn't even notice me because he's holding the damned list, reading through it. But he looks up and his reaction confirms my suspicions. Surprise, concern, anger, but he plays it off quickly, tells me he's surprised to see me out here already. I ask him what he's doing, making a house call. I ask what about physician-patient privilege. He tells me very curtly that he has to go. I decide to go ahead and talk with the family. I find the wife alone. Of course, she doesn't tell me anything. She's obviously scared, but when I bring it up she says she just doesn't feel well, so I ask if she wants me to take her to the hospital. I see panic in her eyes as she tells me no, she just has a headache or something. Keep in mind she's acting like this after pretty much parroting what all the others said, singing the hospital's praises. Something's going on here, and it's getting buried. I can feel it. That night, I'm in my room, staying in a small house with my colleague. I'm thinking through my interviews and looking through my notes. It's very late, and I should be in bed, when I hear footsteps outside my window. I glance outside but nobody's there. By this point my suspicions have kind of got my anxiety heightened. I'm a researcher after all, and part of my training involves knowing when you're stepping on people's toes. I could sense that when I ran into Dr. Gomez earlier today. I'm wondering if maybe there's something bigger here than I realized. I hear some movement at the front door. I get up and slowly make my way over to it. Through the gap at the bottom, I see someone's shadow, then it walks away. Footsteps recede, soon it's silent. I don't open the door right way, but when I feel it's safe, I check outside. A strange item is lying on the ground. I'm not sure what I'm looking at first. Looks kind of like a homemade doll, but it's not. It's actually a handful of sticks, all sharpened to a point, each 6 inches long, tied together with a piece of twine. About to pick it up when I realize that a couple of the sticks are actually bones. I don't know much about anatomy, but it looked like maybe a forearm bone, like an ulna, that had been snapped in 2 pieces and bound up with the rest of the sticks. This weird little bundle also has writing all over it. Look closer. They're not words, but ideograms or hieroglyphs. Some of the characters actually resembled Chinese. I'm describing all of this just to give you an image, but the important thing is what was underneath. Hard to tell in the dark, but pretty sure it was a pool of blood. I heard movement again, and I looked around, couldn't see much of anything. Decided to leave the thing there, go back inside, figure I'll tell my colleague before we leave the house the next morning, so she doesn't freak out. I do this, but when I go to show her the item, it's gone. My colleague thinks I'm playing a trick on her. I insisted I saw what I described to you. She has a hard time believing me. Understandable. There isn't even a stain where I said I saw blood. In the end she just shrugs and says we should forget about it. Fast forward, the 2 weeks are over. We're preparing to leave. In the end I never discovered why the locals were frightened of the hospital. Since they'd changed their tune I couldn't even mention it in my policy recommendation. So I wrote some report on cultural competency urging the scientific community to engage with locals on 1-1 in the hopes that something would come to light. I never heard anything more on the matter, but I talked to my colleague a few months later, brought up the weird item. She said she'd been meaning to tell me something that morning when I told her about the item. Afterwards, we'd resumed our work, visiting dozens of locals. She was especially eager to finish up our final report, but during that time, in a few different houses, she noticed items like the one I described to her. Some were pretty different, but some were almost identical. She saw clumps of dirt and moss tied together, sticks tied together with twine, sharpened to a point. Some had writing, some didn't. When these objects did have writing, she noticed it looked like Chinese, or like hieroglyphs, exactly like I had described to her. Of course, she was struck by this, but she was pretty consumed with the wrap-up process since we were nearing the end of our stay, plus it just didn't seem relevant to our report. Still, she jotted down notes about these items just in case. Later, after we left, she looked over her notes and made a weird discovery. These items were all concentrated within a specific area. Every single household was sitting more or less in the perimeter of the hospital, a big circle all the way around. She believed this was likely a coincidence. I still don't know what to think.